This is a short introduction about what Dasesa is and does. Dasesa is a platform for connecting researchers and survey respondents and enable seamless data collection. For example, a researcher might want to study how the time spent by high school students on TikTok in Addis Ababa is related with their entrance exam result. The researcher might, for example, wants to test the research question, does spending time on TikTok relates with poor entrance exam result? In this case, two types of data should be collected from high schoolers who already sat for entrance exam in Addis Ababa. One is the average time they spent on TikTok per day the year they took the entrance exam, and the other is their entrance exam score that same year. So the researcher needs a sample of respondents who finished high school and willing to give this information. Should the researcher go around colleges finding previous year high schoolers to respond to a survey question? No, that is not necessary, and that is where Dasesa comes to help. The researcher can reach the high schoolers from the comfort of his or her laptops. On Dasesa, we have a diverse participant pool where researchers can filter and contact particular respondents and be able to recruit them to their study. In this particular case, relevant participants are previous high schoolers, with current education as post-high school, age between 15 to 20. The researcher sets this criteria as filters on Dasesa, and is able to ask this group of population to respond to survey questions. But some type of studies a researcher conducts require a group of participants who by some reason are not available on digital platforms. For example, that reason could be infrastructure related, where individuals might have poor internet coverage or lack devices that support applications, or person related, where individuals might be not technology friendly, or they have less interest in apps, or lack knowledge in the use and application of technology. So, Dasesa's participant pool fails to reach this population group directly. But that doesn't mean Dasesa fails to reach them at all. We reach them through you. That is where you serve as a bridge. Your responsibilities therefore when signing up as a subsidy or surveyor is to enable a researcher connect with group of participants who by one or many reasons are not reachable through Dasesa directly. What you are expected to do practically in Dasesa Surveyor can be a sequence of tasks. You need to select relevant posts you are interested with. You are supposed to check whether the type of data you are asked to collect and the ethical approval document matches each other. You contact the group of participants the researcher wanted a response from. You follow sampling techniques, as suggested by the researcher, to decide who to contact and who to gather the survey responses from. And before accepting survey jobs, you are also expected to make sure you can reach the specified number of respondents in the deadline specified. If you can reach the respondents but the deadline is unable, you are expected to ask for a new deadline before you take the job. In the next pages, there is a mini course about these techniques. There are two things that are important to us. One is trust and the other is trust. Is important because outcomes of the study are important and affects key decision and policy making. Therefore, correctness of the responses is very important to both us and the researcher who is recruiting you. By correctness, we mean whether the responses you submitted belong to particular individuals in the sampling group. It is of utmost importance that the response data you feed in is accurately as what the researcher is requiring. We have our own means of verifying the validity of each response. And your payment is processed once the responses are verified. The second is time. It is important that you stick with deadlines of delivery. If you believe you can't deliver in the agreed deadline, you are supposed to inform the researcher as soon as possible.
Welcome to the mini course. In this course 6 points are discussed. These are ethical approval, informed consent, personal data, sampling techniques, data and response types. After the discussion, you will be presented with 15 questions. You must answer at least 11 of the question to be accepted and registered as a Dasesa surveyor. Ethical approval. Any research has to have scientific validity and ethical acceptability, and a researcher gathering data through our surveyor functionality have to fulfill this before data is collected and participants are contacted. It is therefore required that a researcher aiming to collect data through our surveyor platform has to present a document of ethical approval verification. Such a document, depending on the scope of a research, can be granted from 3 bodies if the data collection is conducted in Ethiopia. If the research is in the area of health and nutrition, the Scientific and Ethical Review Office, which is under the Ethiopian Public Health Institute, the body to approve a study. Second are universities where the researcher belongs to. Third are regional authorities like Health or Education Bureau. Your role as a surveyor is therefore to make sure you carry with yourself the ethical approval of the research as you go out for the data collection task and meet respondents. Informed consent. Informed consent is one of the founding principles of research ethics. Its intent is that human participants can enter research voluntarily with full information about what it means for them to take part, and that they give consent before they enter the research. Consent should be obtained before the participant enters the research, and there must be no undue influence on participants to consent. The minimum requirements for consent to be informed are that the participant understands what the research is and what they are consenting to. There are two distinct stages to a standard consent process for competent adults. Stage 1 is giving information. Here, the data collector or researcher has to provide an introduction page about what the study is about in terms of the research, often as separate bullet points or clauses, to participants. Stage 2 is obtaining of consent. The data collector has to obtain consent. This means the respondent agrees to each term by giving explicit consent before agreeing to take part in the project as a whole. Then it can be declared that consent been obtained. So as a data collector for Dasesa, it is your responsibility to make sure the participant is informed about the study and they give their consents before you collect the main data. Personal data. Personal data is any information that relates to an identified or identifiable living individual. Major examples include name, email, phone number, national identification number, race, ethnicity, bank information. Sometimes different pieces of information, which collected together can lead to the identification of a particular person, also constitute personal data. Your role as a Dasesa data collector is to make sure no personal data of participants is registered unless the researcher has a special approval for collecting such information, and the participant is willing to hand over such information. Sampling. Sampling means selecting the group that we actually collect data from in a research. For example, if we are researching about the opinions of high school students in Addis Ababa, we could survey a sample of 100 high school students. Two main techniques of sampling are used in research. These are called probability and non-probability sampling. In probability sampling, the sample is selected randomly, and every member of the population has an equal chance of being included. Techniques in this category include simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified sampling, and cluster sampling. In non-probability sampling, the sample is selected based on non-random criteria, and not every member of the population has a chance of being included. Techniques in this category include convenience sampling, voluntary response sampling, purposive sampling, and snowball sampling. The researcher recruiting you to collect data might want a specific sampling method, and they attach together with the survey questions. Sampling guideline. When you contact survey respondents, you must therefore make sure the sampling guidelines are followed. Probability sampling. Four of the most common probability sampling techniques are now shortly discussed. First one is the simple random sampling technique. It is a technique in which the researcher randomly selects a subset of participants from a population. Second one is the systematic sampling technique. Here sample members from a larger population are tested according to a random starting point, but with a fixed, periodic interval. Third is stratified sampling technique. This is a technique in which researchers or data collectors divide the entire population into numerous strata, based on some shared characteristics, before randomly selecting participants. Fourth one is cluster sampling. This is a technique the researcher or the data collector divides a population into clusters, such as districts or schools, and then randomly selects some of these clusters as the sample. Non-probability sampling. Four of the most common non-probability sampling techniques are now shortly discussed. First one is convenience sampling technique. It is a technique that involves using respondents who are convenient to the researcher. There is no pattern whatsoever in acquiring these respondents. They may be recruited merely asking people who are present in the street, in a public building, or in a workplace. Second one is voluntary response sampling. A type of sample made up of self-chosen participants are included. These participants volunteer to take part in different research studies to share their opinions on topics that interest them. Third is purposive sampling. This is a technique in which researchers or data collectors rely on their own judgment when choosing members of the population to participate in their surveys. Fourth one, snowball sampling. This is a technique where existing study subjects recruit future subjects from among their acquaintances. Thus the sample group is said to grow like a rolling snowball.